Neversoft Spider-Man 2000 was a groundbreaking innovator for comic-based video games. It's easily the best superhero game of the era, and it set the standard for what superhero games would be moving forward. This game exposed me to the greater Marvel universe long before I had ever seen any of the cartoons or been exposed to any of the movies, most of which hadn't really been made yet. Not only that, but it also had groundbreaking gameplay and level design for a game from its era, which makes it pretty painful to see this game get overlooked whenever people talk about Spider-Man video games. So today, we wanted to celebrate the game's 20th anniversary. Because of recent projects like One Marvelous Scene and Star Wars Defined, I was inspired to start an open collaboration of my own, based around the 20th anniversary of this marvelous game. To see other YouTubers take on the game, like
Panels to Pixels,
Diego Rivera,
Anganoff,
and
Crystal Gamer,
check out the link in the playlist at the end of the video or in the description down below. And if you would like your own Spider-Man 2000 video featured, send it to me on Twitter or Discord and I'll add it to the playlist. Now let's make like Venom and
surf the web, surf the web.
True believers and newcomers alike. Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee here. Once again, we find our hero Peter Parker, better known around the world as the Amazing Spider-Man, in a heap of trouble. But this is just the beginning, Spidey fans. So get ready for a true superhero action thriller, packed to the brim with thrills and chills, twists and turns, more supervillains than you can shake a web at, and of course, non-stop web-slinging, wall-crawling action.
I don't want to believe that you pulled off the heist today. I've got to make sure.
Technology is the light that will cut through the darkness.
No one can control the symbiotes. No one!
The symbiote invasion cannot be stopped.
Not this time. I'm making this my fight.
Spider-Man 2000 was my first exposure to the Spider-Man lore and the greater Marvel multiverse at large. Growing up, I was always more of a DC kid, and outside of seeing the 2002 movie once on a bootleg VHS, I had never really interacted with Marvel media until they started syndicating the old 90s cartoons on Jetix around 2004. So for a good portion of my childhood, this game was the only exposure to the Marvel multiverse that I had. It ended up becoming the baseline for what I consider Spider-Man to be, and it introduced me to parts of Spider-Man's lore that I otherwise never would have been aware of. And honestly, it made me a fan of Spidey for life. So much to the point that I still read Spider-Man comics in Rino Romano's voice, specifically because this game was so formative to how I view the Spider-Man mythos.
Oh, you're just too clever for me, JJ.
There he is, officers! The man behind the Science Expo heist! Shoot him now! Shoot him!
JJ, you're out of the wheel! I mean it this time!
This game is a love letter to the 40 years of Spider-Man comics that preceded it, and set the standard for the 20 years of Spider-Man games that came after it. There are references to everything from Amazing Fantasy 15, all the way up through the Clone Saga and Planet of the Symbiotes, books that were less than 10 years old at the time of this game's release. So how did we get here? It all starts with a ragtag team of developers called Neversoft. Neversoft got the license for Spider-Man from Activision as the team was nearing completion on the original Tony Hawk Pro Skater. They built the game with the same engine that had been used for Tony Hawk and Apokalips beforehand. Everyone on the team had grown up playing Spider-Man, so it was a natural fit. They all knew that licensed superhero games had a bad reputation for being cheap, rushed, clunky messes. The team spent an entire year just working on how Spider-Man would control and maneuver around Neversoft's New York City, and level design proved to be a daunting task as well. Most characters in video games from that era were constricted to the ground floor and couldn't stick to a roof or go literally anywhere in the level, so that had to be taken into account in terms of level design. But that was just one hurdle that the dev team had to overcome during the production of the game. The game actually has a lot of examples of the technical limitations of the PS1 being utilized in really creative ways, like explaining that the world had been filled with fog in order to make it impossible to see below the building tops, getting around what the PlayStation 1 would have been able to render at the time. And in other levels, you can crawl through elongated hallways and tunnels while new parts of the level load in the background, and old parts of the level are wiped from the RAM as you go, making the game's world feel more open, without it necessarily being an open world. And as far as gameplay goes, it's pretty much a platformer beat-em-up, with the platforming gameplay being expressed through the wall crawling and swinging mechanics, as well as some other basic combat, with just enough options to keep it from getting too stale too quickly. You can throw webs, pick up items, punch, kick, pretty much do whatever a Spider-Man can. But I think where the game really shines is its level design, which has a lot of variation, with levels being specifically catered towards Spidey's powers. There's a clear difference between the levels that would focus on web-swinging, combat, and traversing the city, versus the levels focused on wall climbing and puzzle-solving platforming. And in between, there are some expertly crafted levels that manage to mix these elements. It's the late game water levels that do this the best in my opinion. I always thought these levels in particular were just beautiful, and I still do. Check them out, they're vaporwave as fuck.
Could it be? Serve the web. Now? Yes. We have no choice.
Wait, make more noise.
I'm serious when I say no two levels in the game are exactly alike, because despite the game's linear nature, its world always manages to feel open and full of life, because the Easter eggs and collectibles in Spider-Man 2000 are dense and plentiful, especially for a game from its era. From hidden areas like the Green Goblin's lair, to a lizard cameo that I never even knew existed until over a decade after I played the game for the first time.
Venom has imprisoned me and has taken my lair. Now he's using my lizard man against you.
And there are tons of unlockable costumes, all referencing various Spider-Man suits from across the years. Anything and everything from Bombastic Bagman to Spider-Man Unlimited. And there are tons of comics hidden around the levels as well. And when you find one, you unlock it in the comic gallery, and then you get to read about what makes that issue significant. When I was a kid, I spent hours finding these comics and reading their descriptions. They introduced me to spider lore I otherwise never would have been aware of. Especially seeing as I played this game years before I ever knew how to use the internet well enough to navigate early Spidey fan sites like spiderfan.org. And the game's soundtrack is top tier too, being composed by legendary video game musician Tommy Tallarico. Now I'm not the biggest music buff, so I can't tell you exactly what makes these pieces technically appealing. That's more Josh from Panels to Pixels specialty. But what I can tell you is that I enjoy the soundtrack enough to listen to it independently from the game. And as an added bonus, the rights to the soundtrack are tied up in limbo between Tallarico, Activision, Marvel, and a horde of ravenous lawyers. So if you're a YouTuber and you want to use music from the game inside of one of your videos, the music won't get your videos claimed for copyright because the rights are tied up between the three companies.
Knowledge.
Moving on from the technical aspects of the game, let's talk about the world it created. Neversoft Spider-Man does a great job introducing newcomers to the world of Spider-Man. It covers nearly every angle of Spidey lore, from street-level crime to bank robberies, trouble at the Bugle, rampaging rhinos, sewer monsters, symbiotes, mad scientists, and more. It's actually pretty clever how they escalate the threats of each level as the game progresses, from basic street crime and bank robberies in the beginning, all the way to Avenger-level alien threats in the end. And speaking of the Avengers, this game is full of cameos, with characters like Daredevil, Human Torch, and Punisher all popping up throughout the story, making the world of Spider-Man 2000 feel more authentically Marvel than any other comic book game from its era. And in my opinion, it even does a better job of making the game feel more Marvel than Insomniac's Spider-Man did nearly 2 decades later. One of my biggest complaints about Spider-Man PS4 was how empty the world felt in terms of costume cameos. While certain characters, like Black Panther and the Avengers, got references, the characters themselves were never actually seen or mentioned outside of those empty landmarks. But that's not a problem for SM2K, because you don't just happen to swing past an empty Baxter building.
Man, looks like the Fantastic Four aren't around right now.
They follow up on that with a scene later on that showcases Johnny and Peter's friendship, just like in the comics. Other ways they build off the lore include creating unique one-off characters like Monster Rock. Even though the character concept was created for the game, it combines elements of pre-existing lore in a way that makes sense for the franchise. Edge of Time even ripped off the concept for their own game over a decade later, and Slot did something similar with Red Goblin in the comics. And just to double down on the authenticity that Neversoft brought to Spider-Man 2000, the game's chapters are all given their own comic covers, and the game as a whole is even narrated by the late Stan Lee himself, giving this game the ultimate Marvel stamp of approval, making it a true diamond in the rough when it came to PS1 era comic book games.
Well, Spidey fans, thus ends our tale. For now, we hope you enjoyed our scintillating saga of nefarious villains scheming and spectacular hero daring do. But until next time, true believers, Excelsior!
The gameplay presented in Spider-Man 2000 went on to influence nearly every Spider-Man game to come for an entire decade, with its gameplay being reused and taken a step further in games like Enter Electro, Spider-Man the Movie, and Spider-Man 2 for PSP. While Spider-Man 2 for consoles has served as the core inspiration for later open-world Spider-Man games, Spider-Man 2000 has often served as the base for Spider-Man games that have more limited scopes, with the developers of games like LEGO Marvel and Disney Infinity directly citing Spider-Man 2000 as a reference for how they chose to approach Spider-Man in their own brawling platformer hybrids. Even though the game often gets overshadowed by some of the other games that hold a stronger influence on modern Spider-Man games, it's impossible to deny that Spider-Man 2000 was an essential building block that helped future developers figure out where to go with the character next. This was Spider-Man's first step into the third dimension, and he didn't just walk through it, he came in swinging.
Venom's ugly face on that big screen? Now that's scary.
You gotta get me out of here.
Even today, the game's spirit is kept alive by a group of gamers that never stop playing it. People who are still uncovering mysteries inside of its code today, sometimes even releasing new content for the game like custom skins. Crystal developed a custom texture loader for Spider-Man 2000's PC port, enabling hundreds of artists to create custom skins and textures for the game. And modders like Solid Snake 11 restored broken levels from the game's beta, and did hours upon hours of research on the game's internal workings, and then put it all on YouTube for anyone and everyone to see. And then there's folks like Big Rig, who ported the models and levels into Blender, that way we could get shots like this that would have been impossible otherwise. He's even done some work to get the game's models into games like Gmod and Source Filmmaker as well, so that users like Anganoff can use them to make shorts like this.
Ah! Stop! I could've dropped my croissant!
Just smile, dude.
Awkward.
Do some exercise.
Awkward.
You'll feel better.
Awkward. Awkward.
In addition to making memes and Source Filmmaker videos based around Spider-Man 2000, Anganoff even managed to find a hidden prototype version of the symbiotes in the game's files, and even managed to get some of the animations working for it. It's assumed that originally, the symbiotes would have been red and Carnage-esque, seeing as they're assumedly his spawn. But then when you look at this design, you realize it would probably be too scary for random kids that would pick up a Spider-Man game. So they changed the design to the pink slimy monsters in the final game. And on top of discovering the prototype symbiote model and textures, Anganoff actually created a great number of costumes for the game as well. And speaking of costumes, there are just so many fan costumes and so many creators who made them that it would be impossible to list them all here. And it's all possible because of Crystal Gamer's custom texture loader. But the love for SM2K doesn't stop there. There are also mods for games like Thug Pro and Left 4 Dead 2 that put models from Spider-Man 2000 into those games, and there's even a lively meme community that still uses this game and clips from it, retrofitting them into whatever new meme format is applicable, bringing 20-year-old references from this game into the modern age. Much like Spider-Man 2, Arkham Asylum, or the original Ultimate Alliance, the love for this game never died out. The modders and memesters kept it alive and relevant for what's now been 20 years since its release. Spider-Man 2000 remains an extremely popular sub-niche of Spider-Man games amongst the comic book video game community. I credit my Spider-Man Lost tie-in comic and Spider-Man 2000 mod video as being my first big breaks on YouTube. Undoubtedly, the influx of traffic and support from the fellas at the Spider-Man 2000 Discord had a lot to do with that. And I'll never be able to thank them enough for giving me that first break and helping me reach a larger audience. Spider-Man is a character, a franchise, and a symbol that means a lot to me. Not a lot of adaptations do the character and his history justice, but this one did. It even set the standard for what I think when I think Spider-Man, and that's pretty cool. So if you have any memories of Spider-Man 2000 that you feel like sharing, feel free to make a Spider-Man 2000 video of your own. Then shoot me a message on Twitter or Discord, and I'll add your Spider-Man 2000 video to the collaborations playlist. And before I go, I'd also like to thank my supporters on Patreon and promote the other videos involved in the collab that you can find in the end card or in the description down below. With all that being said, I've been Swim Team Captain 7, signing off.